Okay, now we can close this and then go here. Very good. Okay, thank you. Good morning. I hope you had a nice Easter break. Sorry for the slight delay. So, this is the list of our lectures. I'm still postponing climate change and water resources. I want to move forward with the next topic, and then after decision theory, I will go back to climate change and water resources. I want to make a decision theory first, because then I have an exercise related to decision theory, which I would like to propose to you as soon as possible, because it has been a long time since we last worked in R and the PC. Okay, now let's focus on decision theory. This is the web page. I'm not sure you can see my screen, probably not. Just 1 second. So I go back. This is the list of lectures, as I said, and you see that I skipped climate change and water resources. Let's go to decision theory then. And this is the web page, the reference web page. The web page opens with a picture, which is the measuring stuff of the nilometer. The nilometer was an ancient instrument that the ancient Egyptians used to measure the water level of the Nile River. And indeed, this is probably the only example, or let's say it's the earliest example of river gauging, people taking measurements of river water levels in the ancient antiquity. And this was done, as you well know, because the Egyptians strongly depended on the Nile River in order to fertilize their fields and also to get water for irrigation. And they realized that when the Nile River was low, it was a period of famine for absence of both fertilization and irrigation. Conversely, when the Nile River was high, they experienced abundance. And therefore, they tried to make an effort to predict the dynamics of the Nile River. Keep in mind that the Nile River is one of the longest rivers in the world, which means that it responds to rainfall with a very long time, a very long response time. And sometimes people were flooded without experiencing any rainfall, because maybe that it rained in Sudan or in Ethiopia, and the Nile River flooded in Egypt, and they didn't see any rainfall, but they were flooded, and therefore they could get fertilizers and water for irrigation. So they made an effort to understand what was going on. And therefore they decided to take measurements of the Nile River water level in order to get information for making a prediction. And they actually took the annual maxima, measurements of the annual maxima, for about 600 years, and this time series is still available. And they measured the water level, the max water level, with this nilometer, this instrument which is called the nilometer. And basically it's a well where the water from the Nile River could get in, and of course, for the principle of the communicating pots, they could measure the Nile River water level in this deep well. So this is a nice example of an attempt to inform a decision, because they wanted to, what was the reason they wanted to understand what was going on? What was the reason they tried to make predictions? Because with a prediction, they could foresee, they could anticipate the periods of abundance and the periods of famine, of water scarcity, fertilizer scarcity. And therefore, with this prediction, they could set up mitigation, adaptation policies. So it was an earlier, probably one of the earliest attempt to make predictions of river flows to inform a decision. It is an earlier example of a decision support system. What is a decision support system? It's a tool that allows us to take informed decisions by evaluating pros and cons. This is the definition of a decision support system, which is something that is extremely useful in water resources. In water resources management, we have to take decisions. And therefore, we look for aids to assist these decisions. We look for tools assisting these decisions. Basically, in a nutshell, what is the role of a decision support system? To allow us to anticipate the outcomes from alternative water resources management policies. So, in water resources management, we have to take decisions because we have to choose among several different alternatives. And therefore, what is a possible criteria to decide, to take the best decision? To try to anticipate what is the result of each alternative. And this is the role of a decision support system. The decision support system may be just perceptual, may be just inside our brain. So basically, we evaluate with the perceptual approach, with a subjective approach. We evaluate the consequences of alternative decisions, and then we take the best one, the one that we prefer. It may be a risky decision. Sometimes we like risk because we want to maximize the possibility of a windfall. A windfall is an unexpected good outcome. Okay, we use the term windfall to mean an unexpected, very good outcome. But usually, if we search a windfall, we have to accept risks. Usually, the decisions that bring the best outcome are also characterized by a high level of risk. Or we may want to minimize the risk. Minimizing the risk means that we choose a decision that, in view of the uncertainties that we always have, as you know, in water resources management, in view of the uncertainty, the decision is safe. Whatever the future will be, the decision is not severely wrong. Usually, these robust decisions do not lead to unexpected windfall, do not lead to really very good benefit, because we pay the mitigation of the risk by, in a way, accepting to lose some potential benefit. So, as I said, this approach may be perceptual. We base on our experience, on our expert knowledge. Every day we take decisions. When you go out and you look at the weather, you may say today it may rain, and you have to decide whether or not to take an umbrella. If you take an umbrella, it's really not very comfortable because you run the risk of forgetting it somewhere. And therefore, if it doesn't rain, it's a wrong decision. It's something that makes your day not as comfortable as it would be if it doesn't rain. But if it rains, then the umbrella, of course, minimizes the discomfort due to the rain. And therefore, you make a balance. Personally, I prefer not to take the umbrella because I know that I run the risk of losing it somewhere. I know that my memory is short in these things. And therefore, it's a perceptual approach. But every day we face decisions. Every day. We don't realize this, but every day we use a perceptual approach to evaluate risk, pros and cons, risks and benefits, and then we decide. Or when you decide where to invest your money, sometimes you have periods in your life where you can accept risks. And therefore, you may take a risky decision in order to seek an unexpected outcome, a very good outcome. In other periods of your life, you may not tolerate risk, and therefore you prefer very safe investments. And usually they are not very fruitful, but on the other hand, you minimize the risk of losing your money. So it's an everyday process. Of course, decision may be easy or complicated. And let me advance with the slides. this is the nilometer, so let's take this, which is nicer. And of course, there are decisions that are easy to be taken, others that are more complicated. And when the complication becomes very high, you feel like you need some support. So you may take the advice of a friend, for instance, or the advice of a relative, of a person whom you trust. And usually, what does it mean that you trust a person? That you know that the person is objective. It's a faithful person, but it's also objective. You know that it's a wise person, and therefore you seek a wise advice. But when the decision is to be taken by a community, the problem becomes more complicated because some people trust one person, other people trust a different person. And therefore you have to seek an objective, a super partes advisor. And this search may not be so easy. And then recently, in modern times, modern but not as, I mean, decision theory has its root in, I would say, in the end of, beginning of the 20th century. So it's a theory that has already a long history. But basically, the idea of people was to substitute the human advisor with some assessment methods, with decision models. And models evaluating the outcomes from a decision. And models potentially are more objective than people, potentially, because of course it depends on how they are set up. It's relatively easy also to twist a model, as you know, because if you change parameters. And therefore, the idea was to introduce the term of a decision support system, to mean a model that assists you in taking decisions. And as I said, this is useful when the decisions are complicated. It would be stupid to use a computer to decide whether or not I have to take the umbrella. But still, you may decide to look at the forecast of the weather. And in this case, you are using indeed a model to assist your decision, because the forecast of the weather, if it says probability of rain 100%, then you think, okay, better if I take the umbrella, okay? And also because you think that it's not so easy to forget an umbrella if it's raining. The risk of forgetting it's in a sunny day, but when it's raining. So this is an example of the use of a modern decision support system. In this case, actually, the decision is still left to your subjectivity. You look at the forecast of the weather, but at the end you decide. There are decision support systems that really take into account several sources of information and identify for you the best decision. So there might be a decision support system that looks at the forecast of the weather and knows your propensity to forget the umbrella, and therefore says, okay, for another person that has a stronger memory than you, I would suggest not to take the umbrella. But in your case, by taking this kind of information, additional information beyond the forecast of the weather into account, I suggest that you don't take your umbrella. Okay, and so it's a nice trip, a nice journey to navigate through the history of these decision support systems and learn what are the approaches that are most used in water resources management. And it's a journey that is partly descriptive and partly relying on some math. So be prepared, because at the beginning there is not much math, but at the end of this journey, which will last, I think, for about 4 hours, 2 hours today, and maybe two more hours next Thursday, because on Monday it's public holiday in Italy. Okay, so I think this slide basically says some considerations that I already introduced to you. And let me introduce some terms, some terminology. First, uncertainty. Uncertainty means that your information to support your decision is uncertain. An example is the annual rainfall or the rain tomorrow. you may decide whether or not to irrigate your garden by looking at the forecast of the weather. And the forecast of the weather says tomorrow you have 20% probability of rain. This means uncertainty, because it doesn't say tomorrow it will rain, but it says may rain, may not, with the probability of 20%. This is uncertainty. Also, the forecast of the weather may tell you what is the rainfall depth expected, and it may say if it rains, it may rain with the probability of 20%. If it rains, you may get a rain between 15 millimeters and 25 millimeters. So there are several uncertainties in the information, and therefore beware of the fact that usually uncertainty is evaluated with probability theory, and therefore decision theory is very often associated to probability theory. But not always, not always. There are other theories that allow you to deal with uncertainty, and you may have heard somebody talking about fuzzy logic. Fuzzy logic may be an alternative to probability to manage uncertain information, or you may have heard something like possibility theory, which doesn't say if an event, doesn't say the probability of an event. It only says if an event is possible or impossible. And so there are several other theories. We will make reference to probability theory, but not always. And when I talked about approaches based on expert knowledge or approaches based on individual decisions based on your experience, these are called very often heuristic approaches. Heuristic means that it's something that is dictated by experience. You choose the best choice by relying on your expert knowledge, and there is not a system model behind the decision support system. There is not a quantitative model, an analytical model of what's going on, but there is instead a kind of black box, something that tells you what is the best decision based on preliminary information. These heuristic approaches, examples of heuristic approaches are machine learning methods, for instance. You may have heard terms like machine learning, deep learning. Basically, these are methods that look at data, so they look at experience. They look at past data, historical data, look at the information, and by just looking at the information, they decide what is the best solution without attempting to, as I said, to develop a quantitative model of what's going on, without developing a process-based model. So a model that attempts to make a description of the processes. Heuristic approaches may be also called empirical approaches. Okay, they are widely used, and especially in the past. And also they are usually simple, and this is the reason why they are preferred. And models are more complicated. And keep in mind that there is, in decision theory, there is an important benefit associated to simple models. They have more convincing power, usually. If the model is very complicated, people don't trust them. You may wonder, why are you talking about people? Because in water resources management, the modern tendency is to take participatory decisions, to adopt a participatory approach. It means that we don't give to water is something, it's a public good, it's something that is essential for our life, and therefore we realized that top-down decisions, which are imposed basically from the top, from the authority, are not very popular, are not very effective. In water resources management, people have to be convinced that the solution, the strategy is a good one. And it's not a good option to say, I decided this is a good strategy. People have to be convinced, and the way to convince them is to involve them into the decision. And so this is why I talked about convincing power of a model. So people really have to feel that they have a say, they are involved in the decision. This makes the decision more complicated. It's much easier to take top-down approaches, and this is the approach that is taken under emergency. We are experienced on that after 2 years of pandemics, and we realize that when there is the need of taking urgent decision, then modern governments have the opportunity to declare the state of emergency, which allows the government to take decision without getting the approval of the parliament. And getting the approval of the parliament is a way to involve the community, of course. And but if we are not in an emergency, as I said, decisions take longer. They become more complicated, but we must make an effort to involve people. And when we involve people, we have to care about the convincing power of the decision support system. And this is also why we prefer to use object-oriented computer programs. So in a way, what does it mean, object-oriented? It means that you see on the screen not the lines of a code of an algorithm, which are not understandable by people. If you show an R code to the public, they don't understand it. But you show objects like a dam, like an irrigation system, and you show a pipe connecting the dam to the irrigation system. And you may show an equation along the pipe, but it's not necessary for people to understand the equation in order to see that there is a connection that you are taking into account. Because you show on the screen the connection, the pipe, and then you also show the equation for the people who are prepared to read it. But you don't show only the equation. The equation doesn't show that there is a connection between the dam and the irrigation system. Instead, with an object-oriented approach, you see the connection, and people realize that those who are prepared can see the quantitative form of the connection. So people see both the idea and the technical aspect of it. Some people may not understand the technical aspect, but still they see very clearly what's going on. This is object-oriented, okay? And there are several decision support systems that are object-oriented, available on the web. Some of them are public domain. Okay, now, let me see what I can say about this slide, because I think it is quite obvious. First, let me say one thing, and I go back to the web page because there is a link that I want to show you. Decision theory, it's a well-known field. It is, this is the Wikipedia page. We are interested in the normative decision theory concerned with the identification of optimal decisions. And optimality, that is written here, is often determined by considering an ideal decision maker who is able to calculate with perfect accuracy and, in some sense, fully rational. We are interested in this, but the field of decision theory is very wide. There are books and courses on decision theory. We make, of course, a very short synthesis focused on water resources management, which is fine. I mean, it is what we have to learn. And first, as I said, there is a long history behind it, and water resources management, and therefore sustainable water resources management, is tightly connected to decision theory. And you may have heard the terms like linear programming. It was the first attempt to set up a decision support system. You don't have to learn this. But what you have to keep in mind is that at the beginning, we looked for optimal decisions. So the decisions that, like when we calibrate a model, optimize an objective function. So the first idea was to write down an objective function. Typically, it may be an economic benefit, but not necessarily. It's an objective that we want to reach. The objective function may be that we want to maximize the volume of water arriving in the field during the dry season, for instance, which is related to the economic benefit, but it's a little bit different. So at the beginning, we decided for an objective function, and we looked for the decision maximizing, reaching, optimizing this objective function, optimizing. And at the beginning, we didn't care about uncertainty. So we assumed that the information was correct. And then we, under the assumption of correctness, or under the assumption, let's say, that uncertainty was not really so huge, we looked for the optimum of an objective function. But then people quickly realized that what was the effect of uncertainty? So decision didn't deliver the expected outcomes. Not always. In some cases, yes. In some other cases, not. I want to give you an example. When people had to design the dams in the 20th century, most of the dams all over the world were built between 1920 and 1970. And they had to decide the optimal size. They had to consider the water demands and the flow duration curve, because you want to fill a dam. If you build a dam that it's not filled because it's too large, the volume is too large, of course, it's not a good decision. So they had to study the water demands and the flow duration curve. And then they estimated the flow duration curve, they estimated the water demands, and determined the size of the reservoir. But they didn't consider the fact that the flow duration curve is affected by uncertainty. They just estimated one flow duration curve, which is the average. It's representative of the average, but the average doesn't happen. The average is something that is ideal. It's not. It doesn't. It never happens, the average. So there are some years where you are close to the average, and then the decision gives the expected results. There are other years where the flow duration curve is much different from the average, as we know, because we tried it. And the same for demands. People estimated the demands, but there is uncertainty, because if there is a dry year, people demand for more water. So you have less water coming into the dam, into the reservoir, and more water going out because people are demanding for it. So they realized that uncertainty, indeed, in some cases, produced the effect that the dam was not enough. The dam was turned out to be empty when water was needed. And in these cases, when you have an adaptation option that fails, sometimes the damage is even higher, the situation is even worse than the original situation with no dam. Because people are prepared, they see the dam, they expect water, so they change the crops, they may adopt crops that are more water demanding, and then the dam fails, and of course the damage is even higher. And therefore, people realize that looking for the optimal decision may be not the good choice in some cases. And they started to consider decisions that were robust. This is another term that I want to introduce. What does it mean, robust? A robust decision is not the optimal decision. It is unlikely that it leads to the optimum, but it is safer. It is safer in the face of uncertainty. And this was really a very significant step forward. You see the last line. The last two lines. Recent years have seen an increasing interest in tools and methods for the identification of robust rather than optimal decisions. They seek a robust strategy. what is a robust strategy? A strategy that performs well compared to the alternatives over a wide range of plausible futures, which means in the face of uncertainty. So I have uncertainty, okay, it means that the future may get several possible configurations. A robust strategy is a strategy that gives a minimum reward, which is always granted. And therefore, people started to think of a minimum reward rather than an optimal one. So what is the minimum reward that ensures that I'm not failing? I'm not losing my money. And then the robust decision is a decision that in the face of uncertainty always gives the minimum reward. Sometimes they are also called, with a modern terminology, no regret decisions. Okay, people may be not fully happy, but still they don't regret. If there is uncertainty, this may be preferable. And of course, it is a subjective choice. If you are willing to take risks, you may drop a robust decision. If you are not willing to take risk, then you may stick. You may really want a robust decision. Okay, so at this time we have to have a look at the methods. At this stage we know what is uncertainty, we know what is a simple approach, an heuristic or empirical approach, we know what is a more elaborated model, we know what is an objective function of which we may search for an optimum, we know what is a windfall, we know what is the risk. Okay. Actually, we don't still know what is the risk. And let's just, for now, anticipate that the risk is a combination of an hazard, a danger, an hazard, like probability of a flood, this is an hazard. And then it's a mix between the hazard, vulnerability. Vulnerability means, do I have a levee that protects me against a flood, or the levee may fail? It means that the same flood, depending on the vulnerability, may get into my house or not. And the third element, which we will see these details later, not now. The third element is exposure. It means economic value. So if I have a flood entering into my house, what is the amount of money that I lose? This is risk. It's the combination of three factors: hazard, and vulnerability, and exposure. So you also know now what is the risk. Let's try to have a look at these methods. And these methods have been developed in the past 20 years. Past 20 years means very recent ones. So you understand that I told you the history of water resources management goes back 15 years, 70s of the past century. And then computing resources became available in the 90s, so 30 years ago, which means that at the beginning people decided with heuristic methods, and heuristic methods with very limited assistance of computational facilities. Complicated models have at most 30 years. And these models, which I'm describing now, as I said, have about 20 years. They have had already a long history of application. It's long in the sense of 20 years, so not very long. But in a way, its technology transfer has already taken place for these approaches. It's not easy to describe them in 15 minutes each. I will try to make a synthesis, but I will also try to use simple words And maybe that basing also on our interaction, I will simplify further the wording in my website. But what I'm showing here is already included here. You see, Infogap is here. Okay, Infogap. There is a Wikipedia page, which I am showing you. Infogap decision theory. And let's see what's written here. Seeks to optimize robustness to failure under severe uncertainty. I think we know these terms already. Okay. And then if you move forward by reading, you see that in particular applying sensitivity analysis of a stability radius type becomes too complicated. We need to stick on the slides and what's written in my web pages. It's a bit more simplified. I'm not an expert on these topics, but I had to manage with some of them. Also in some theses. So with some theses with the students, but also with some applications. Okay, and keep in mind one thing. When we talk about decision-making in water resources management, there is always a ghost behind the door, and the ghost is climate change. So most of these methods have been inspired by the need of taking into account climate change, which is something for which we still have too limited knowledge, especially in engineering. So how to account for climate change? And you for sure know that the predictions of future climate are affected by a lot of uncertainty. And therefore, even if we know that climate is going to worsen in the future, but in what way, especially for what refers rainfall, this is really complicated. There is a lot of uncertainty. When we talk about temperature, temperature is easier to predict because temperature is slowly varying. Just simplifying things, I may say temperature is slowly varying in space and times, slowly. Rainfall, it's suddenly varying in space and time. It's more complicated to describe. And therefore, there is a lot of uncertainty. So there is this ghost behind. So I will make reference to climate change very frequently. Okay, so first, Infogap. What is the reason why they called it Infogap? Because it means that they deal with decisions where the available information is not very large. There is a gap of information. There is a gap of information, which means that there is uncertainty. The gap of information may be in a future scenario, climate change. There is a gap of information on climate change, how future rainfall will behave. There is a gap of information. Or if you have a decision model, parameters may be affected by uncertainty. We studied rainfall runoff modeling. Rainfall runoff modeling can be used as a decision support system to reconstruct river flows. I want to know what is the flow duration curve because I have to take a decision, estimate the design flow for a river barrage. The flow duration curve is known with uncertainty, and therefore I may use a rainfall runoff model to reduce the uncertainty, but we know that parameters of the model are affected by uncertainty themselves. And therefore, Infogap means uncertainty, first of all. Infogap is a mismatch, read the second line, between what is known and what needs to be known to make a good decision. So we have this mismatch. And so what is the idea behind the Infogaps? The idea is to assess how wrong can the available information be without compromising the outcome. So the idea is, I don't know future rainfall. How wrong can I be in estimate future rainfall without compromising the outcome? This is the idea. Therefore, I compare different decisions. So maybe that if I take decision A, the level of uncertainty that is tolerated by decision A is very low in order to give an acceptable outcome. Decision A may tolerate an uncertainty of plus minus 10% in the definition of the future rainfall. Decision B, on the contrary, can tolerate plus minus 30% in order to give a good outcome, an acceptable outcome. And then one may say, I prefer decision B, because in the face of uncertainty, I know that I have a lot of uncertainty, I prefer decision B. And you may say, this is an obvious decision, because if I get to a point where I can identify a decision that is well working, no matter uncertainty, you would say, oh, this is perfect. But there is the drawback, the downside. The downside is that probably if you take a robust decision, we know that it is unlikely that it leads to the best solution. It is unlikely that I can get an unexpected windfall. Okay? And therefore, Infogap starts from the idea of estimating how much uncertainty I can tolerate, and the larger the better. But there is another idea, a side idea, which is to estimate what is the likelihood of getting an unexpected outcome. And what I am expecting is that the decision that tolerates a larger uncertainty is less likely to give an unexpectedly good outcome. So the idea is to present this trade-off. And then the user can decide. This is the idea behind the Infogap. And look at now let's, to be more quantitative. In order to apply Infogap, you need a method for estimating uncertainty. So if it is future rainfall, you have to get an estimate of the uncertainty of the future rainfall. If it is model parameters, you have to get an estimate of the uncertainty of model parameters. You have to know how much uncertain you are. Okay? Then you need a model to evaluate the performances, which is like a rainfall runoff model. So you need an estimate of the uncertainty of the rainfall runoff model parameters. You need the rainfall runoff model. And then at the end, you need an evaluation of performance, an objective function, something like allows you to define what is an acceptable outcome and what is a windfall. So you need these three elements. Which are I already implicitly mentioned when I said you have to evaluate uncertainty and you have to take the decision that ensures robustness against your uncertainty to give a minimum performance. I already mentioned a model for estimating uncertainty implicitly, a model for describing the system, and a method to evaluate the performances. Now let's look at the last line in this slide. So, what is robustness of an intervention, which is evaluated by the Infogap? Is the max range of information uncertainty, input data, model parameters. I mentioned future rainfall. So, robustness is the max range of information uncertainty that can be tolerated, negotiated, while maintaining specific performance requirements. This is the robustness. And now there is the side idea, the sister idea of evaluating the likelihood of a windfall, because I need a trade-off. I mean, if you really want to present something objective, you have to present also what is interesting for people that are willing to take a risk. Robustness, if you only evaluate robustness, you meet the expectation of people who don't want to risk, and they look for a robust decision. Okay, but let's present the side idea. So, one possibility then is to optimize robustness to failure. And so I try to identify the solution which guarantees a minimum performance requirement, but as I said, the side idea is to evaluate under which uncertain scenario an unexpected windfall may occur. And so what is the question that then the question that decision maker asks when estimating robustness? When estimating robustness, the question is, how wrong can I be to ensure a minimum performance requirement? So how wrong can I be to ensure a minimum performance requirement? And the larger, the better. The larger I can be wrong, the better. And then there is the second question, which is the question that asks the decision maker that is seeking the unexpected windfall, the unexpectedly good outcome. And the second question is, how wrong should I be? I need to be. How wrong I need to be to get an unexpectedly good outcome? So if I take this decision, which is a robust decision, how wrong should I be? How wrong do I need to be in order to get the windfall? The robust decision, of course, doesn't, this is a robust decision-making approach, doesn't lead you to an unexpected windfall by definition. But, of course, if something unexpected occurs, you may get the windfall. So the question is, and this is looking for opportunity, is equivalent to looking for an opportunity. How wrong do I need to be in order to get this unexpected windfall? And in this case, the smaller the better. So if the reply is, you have to be very wrong here. So everything needs to be wrong here. The information at the base, the information, the model parameters, the models need to be very wrong in order to give you an unexpected windfall. This is not a good reply, but instead a good reply could be, look, if something small changes in our predictions, if there is a minimum range of uncertainty in the prediction, you may get the unexpected windfall. And this is the typical answer that a person looking for a windfall wants to hear. And so what is basically the purpose of this method is to give you two functions, a robustness function, which gives how much uncertainty you can tolerate for each decision in order to get a minimum requirements. And then there is an opportuneness function, which tells you basically what is the outcome of, what is the probability of getting an unexpected windfall. In poor words, this is what the opportuneness function gives to you. What is the probability of getting an unexpected windfall? So basically, for each decision, you get an indication of robustness and an indication of the likelihood of getting an unexpected windfall. And what you, of course, what usually happens is that if the larger the robustness and the lowest the likelihood of an unexpected windfall. So to reply to the question of the people that is looking for the windfall, the larger the robustness, and the larger they should be really wrong in order to get the expected windfall. And then when you get for each alternative these two functions, then you can evaluate the trade-off. You see here robustness function, opportuneness function, and so Infogap presents to users robustness and opportuneness curves for each strategy using the same uncertainty model. So basically, you decide the design flow for a river barrage under uncertain flow duration curve, and you get a picture of different design flow values from 10 to 100, for instance, and for each value you get robustness, opportuneness. And the larger the robustness, the lower the opportuneness, usually. And to give you a more detailed example, usually when you plan for a low design flow, you reduce the costs of the intervention, you reduce the management and construction costs, so you lower your risk. But if the design flow is lower, then you understand that you cannot get a windfall, because even if it rains a lot and the river brings a lot of water, you don't have the facilities to bring the water to the user. So it's a robust decision because it minimizes the costs, but on the other hand, it's unlikely that it gives you a windfall. And then if you increase the design flow, then you increase the risk, the robustness, because it means that you really have to get a lot of river flow for paying the costs. So the robustness becomes lower, but you increase the likelihood of, in case it happens that you get an extreme, plenty of water, in this case you can use it. So this would be the unexpected windfall. So you realize through the robustness and the opportuneness function, and you bring this function to people to take a collective participative decision, and then you see what people prefer. And then you have another problem here, because when you present these alternatives, of course, you have people preferring robustness, people preferring opportuneness, and then you have to find a compromise. But this is another story, which we will discuss later. Okay, this is basically Infogap. There are a lot of applications to not only to water resources management, and today I was browsing while I was traveling into the train if there are recent applications, and I found a paper in Nature in 2020, so 2 years ago, describing alternative strategies to monitor the reproduction of living species, the reproduction rate of the living species. They had basically to decide whether to adopt costly monitoring facilities rather than very cheap ones. And the risk is that if you don't monitor carefully, then the reproduction rate may develop without any control. The situation goes out of control, which means that some species may prevail to other ones, and therefore they were evaluating risks and opportunities. And the opportuneness was to minimize the monitoring costs. So to find what is the decision that may be less robust but minimizes the monitoring costs. Okay, now let's look to a category of methods. They are called robust optimization. And look, Infogap is also a kind of robust optimization technique, but Infogap, as we have seen, it's also look at opportunities. So Infogap may lead you to opt to adopt decisions that are not robust. This second category of methods called robust optimization involves the identification of an optimal solution for a problem such that the underlying assumption and constraints are always satisfied in the presence of uncertainty. So here there is a special focus on robustness, and this is why they are called robust optimization methods. Look, so far I am mainly descriptive, as you perceive. Just keep in mind that it may happen that you get at the exam, even in the quiz, some questions on what is Infogap, and then you may have four answers and select what is the right one. Just to give you an example, for instance, the question may be, I'm just elaborating now, how would you define Infogap decision theory and a decision support system? And there might be an answer which says it seeks a trade-off between robustness and opportuneness, or another answer may be it only seeks maximization of robustness, another answer may be something completely different, and then you have to pick up the correct one. So what I want to say is try to fix in mind what are the behavior of these methods in order to be able to recognize when we are talking of Infogap rather than robust optimization or robust decision making. I will, as I said, I will give you, which is not available, but I have to rush a little bit. I will give you, by the end of the lecture, an example of a quiz, okay? The quiz will be 30 questions. The example will be shorter, like 10 or 15. I have to just think about it, because it's, of course, given that we have several appeals of the exam and I need to change the question, it's not easy to identify like 100 questions which are very clearly written and are not, are adapted for a quiz. At the oral, what I may ask is indeed, what is robust optimization? What is Infogap? Can you describe what is an Infogap? And of course, your answer has to be given in 5 minutes, so you have to take less time than I'm taking now. Okay, so robust optimization, and it may work with an objective function. So we can adopt a robust optimization even for calibrating a rain for runoff model. And the objective function in this case is to be optimized with uncertain constraints, uncertain data. And for instance, read the last line, water resources availability for a given future may be not known for sure, but varying into a given range with assigned probabilities. And therefore, the optimum is to be searched under different scenarios of water availability. So, robust optimization, to give you an example that may be comprehensible, maybe well understandable by you, may turn out in using not the average flow duration curve for designing a river barrage, but the lowest one. You remember that when estimating the flow duration curve, we talked about a second approach that is developed by estimating the flow duration curve for each year, and then you get a picture of the variability. You remember that, and you may take the lowest one in order to make sure that you are designing not with respect to the average, but with respect to the worst situation. Or you may take the second lowest one, the third lowest one. This is an example of robust optimization. So there is a method which is called robust decision making, and which is basically following what I just said. So uncertainty is characterized with multiple scenarios of the future, given the available uncertainty. So if you get 100 flow duration curves, you may generate for the future 100 scenarios, each one corresponding to one flow duration curve. And this is this means evaluating uncertainty through a range of of likely scenarios. And these multiple views in robust decision making are just generated by looking at their possibility, not necessary to take into account probability. So you may give the same consideration to the lowest flow duration curve with respect to the average, because the lowest one is still possible. And therefore, you give the same consideration because you want to evaluate what happens even with respect to a scenario that is not likely. But you still want, in the unlikely event that the scenario is taking place, you want to see what happens. And then you, as I said already, you don't look for optimality, but you look for robustness against these different scenarios. And then at the end of the story, you need anyway to select the best decision. You need to select your decision. And therefore, at the end of the story, you need anyway a criteria to make a selection. The criteria may be, I look at the worst situation. The criteria may be, I look at the second worst, at the third worst. I look at the average. But at the end, you need this criteria. Okay, so basically, you generate several scenarios. You evaluate what happens for any of them without considering their probability. At the end, you need a criteria to take the decision. At this stage, at the end, you may consider probability. Like, for instance, okay, the worst one is very unlikely. So let me go for the second worst one, which is still unlikely, but more likely than the worst one. At the end of the story, you may select probability or not. Keep in mind that when you introduce in front of a community the term probability, it's not very transparent. And if you use the term probability in the with the perceptional meaning, like something is not likely, so the probability is low, the probability, okay, this can still be something that people can understand. But when you talk of probability in terms of percentages, like something like 10% probability, probability is something that is associated to a theory that is very quantitative. So just keep in mind that talking about possibility is more transparent than talking about probabilities. It's easy to define possibility. It's easy to understand. Something possible. Or you may say something possible but very unlikely. But if you say something that has a probability of 10%, I mean, it becomes more. So probability can be a part of robust decision making. Just make sure that you use concepts that are very transparent. So, step one of robust decision making, identification of future scenarios. And then you need, like in Infogap, you had step one, identification of uncertainty. Here you have identification of future scenarios, more or less it's the same. Then you need a system model, same as Infogap, something like a rain for an off model. and metrics to evaluate success, same as Infogap. Okay, so far, okay, future scenarios are used as term instead of uncertainty, but the meaning is more or less the same. Why I am already comparing the two methods? Because of course these are two different methods, and you may expect that they lead to the same best decision, and or you may expect to understand how they differ in a way. So I'm trying to compare. Okay, so robust decision making so far, I mean, in the first line of this slide is similar to Infogap. Okay, and keep in mind the metrics is something that you have to discuss with the stakeholders. Okay, because in some cases you may say economic benefit, but then you have the fishermen who say, no, please, I'm not interested in money. When you talk about environment, you have to be very careful to use the term money, okay, because money implies a negative meaning, a negative connotation, which is, I think, it's not correct, because when we talk about benefit, okay, money it's ruled, but if we say benefit, economic benefit can also, doesn't imply that we don't consider the value of the environment. Okay, but actually this is the perception of people. When you talk about something economic, the perception of people is that you are just looking for profit, and you are forgetting other sides of the medal, of the coin, that are difficult to quantify from an economic point of view, like environmental value. It's difficult, or the fish community, the health of the fish community. It's not easy to quantify. So if you just say metrics is economic benefit, keep in mind that it's something that you have to be careful. It's a term that you have to be careful to use. And then, of course, you need in this step to identify the alternative decisions. And also this requires a consultation with stakeholders. But this is the same as Infogap. So this consideration, which I am now elaborating on the need to be participative, to be transparent, they apply also to Infogap. Okay, step 2. Evaluation of system performances, and so you have to apply your model to alternative strategies. Okay, so let me give again the example of the river barrage. You have several different scenarios of future flow duration curves. Then you apply your model, your system model, to evaluate how much water you can deliver to the farmers under the flow duration curves. Okay, and this is the system model. And then there is a third step, which is vulnerability assessment, and this is part of the evaluation of your performance. And vulnerability assessment basically allows you to say allows you to identify what is the vulnerability with respect to the different choices. Like, for instance, if you estimate a design flow that is low, what is the vulnerability of the farmers to that? And the vulnerability is, for instance, is related to the availability of alternative sources. Can they use groundwater or not? If they cannot use groundwater, the vulnerability to a low irrigation flow is higher. Okay. And then basically the information about vulnerability also may lead you to identify additional alternatives. So, for instance, if you identify that a given choice, a given alternative, or a given decision makes the farmers extremely vulnerable, you can adopt a circular approach to identify new strategies. And then you may also identify adaptation options to address vulnerability, like use groundwater. Okay, and then risk management, and basically basing on the likelihood of the future scenarios and basing on assessment of vulnerability and assessment of exposure. It's not explicitly mentioned here, I explain you why. Then you identify your final performance metric, which is the risk to which they are exposed. So different scenarios, different decisions. In view of vulnerability, you estimate the risk to which they are exposed. As I said, risk, we still have to define it, but I anticipate that it's a combination of hazard, so scenarios, vulnerability, and exposure. Here, exposure is not mentioned. Why? Because in the earlier definitions of risks, and still in some definitions, vulnerability and exposures, they are put together, okay? But actually, I think I should mention that in the most recent developments, people tend to divide them in two factors, vulnerability and exposure. Okay, and so what does this method do, basically? What I already mentioned, it reverses the order of traditional decision analysis by conducting an iterative process based on a vulnerability and response option, rather than a predict then act decision framework. So it's to be more understandable, in the optimization analysis, you make a prediction, average flow duration curve, and you estimate your design flow. Here, what you do is to estimate several predictions, estimate the vulnerability, and then the risk of associated to each scenario and each decision, and then you seek the option that is robust against the different scenarios and the assessment of vulnerability. This is something that is termed also bottom-up analysis, because, basically, you don't start from a top-down approach, which is prediction and then action. It's something that you start from vulnerability. So you start from the assessment of the weaknesses of the system, and then you choose the decision that, with respect to the scenarios, minimizes this vulnerability. This is robust decision making. If we want to compare with, let me see if it's already the next slide. No, there is no mention here to the comparison with Infogap, but it is discussed in my webpage. Comparison between robust decision making and Infogap. So what is the difference between these two methods? They are very similar, and actually there have been studies comparing the two, and they came in some cases to the same decision, which is quite normal. If you only look, because the main difference is that Infogap looks not only at robustness, but looks also at opportuneness. But in some cases, depending on the future scenarios and depending on the vulnerability, the two best decisions can be the same, can result to be the same. Actually, Infogap gives more room to the evaluation of unexpected windfalls, and therefore gives more consideration to the tolerance to take risks. Actually, it may be the same thing also with robust decision making, because when you estimate vulnerability, sometimes when you see that vulnerability to some decision is maybe not the lowest one, but it's a vulnerability that is still acceptable, then people may decide, even in the context of a robust decision approach, they may decide to tolerate some more vulnerability because they realize, even if in a non-explicit way, they realize that there is a benefit associated to tolerating some more risk. And therefore, as I said, the two approaches are basically the same, but if I had to identify a difference, is that in Infogap opportuneness, so the likelihood of an expected windfall is explicitly evaluated. And you have this comparison between two functions. Instead, in a robust decision making, you have just an estimate of vulnerability with respect to the different scenarios, risks associated to different scenarios. It's clear that when you evaluate the risk, there is already, an implicit consideration also of opportuneness, because the lowest risk is associated also to the exposure to the vulnerability, and therefore there is implicitly an evaluation of the likelihood of a windfall. But in Infogap, this is more explicit. Okay, we have some minutes. I want to introduce decision scaling, which is, I think, an excellent synthesis. This method has been widely applied, has been explicitly conceived for managing water resources in the face of climate change. And it is, this decision scaling method is included in the category of robust decision making. So it is very similar to robust decision making, but here I think there is a more clear definition of what is the priority. Basically, decision scaling has been conceived as an alternative to the approaches that have been used since then, in 2012, so 10 years ago, to evaluate the impact of climate change. What were the approaches that were used? Generating future climatic scenarios, and then on the basis of future climatic scenarios to estimate, to identify the best decision, either with an optimality approach or with a robust approach. But what was the problem that was evaluated at that time? The problem was that the future climatic scenarios are very dramatic. And why? Because, of course, they are climate models, they are often run with a business as usual emission scenario. So basically, they assume that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere will continue to increase at the same pace as now. This is overly pessimistic, but because we know that we already applied policies for the reduction of the emissions, so it's overly pessimistic, but very often we make reference to this scenario. And also the models are conceived to be conservative. So not only we take the worst emission scenarios, but also the models are conceived to be conservative, because they want to provide a picture of the worst case. So what often happens is that if you identify solutions to these worst scenarios, very often these solutions have high social costs. You may have heard about the social costs of climate change mitigation, which means that we have to use renewable energy, which implies that the price for energy increases. And this started to increase already 5 years ago. It's not only a consequence of the recent European crisis. So there was the feeling that this approach of looking at the scenario, so predict and then act, was overly conservative, implying that the solutions were not practical, and they were in some cases not possible, because of course, you know, a conservative solution is more costly. So what was the idea? The idea was, with decision scaling, to revert the decision-making process by looking at the present and identifying current vulnerabilities, looking at current problems, and identify the solution that solves the current problems. In doing that, you achieve two targets. First, you identify a no-regret solution, because you have a problem now and you solve it. This is no regret. This is the first target that you achieve. The second target is that in identifying current problems, you have little uncertainty, because they are problems that we can see. It's not based on predictions. Of course, what could be the drawback of this approach? The lack of resilience with respect to climate change, to future climate change. And then decision scaling at this stage suggests that once you identify the solution to the current problem, you use the climate scenarios to evaluate the resilience of the solution. So the climate scenarios are used in a second step. The information that has greater uncertainty is used in a second step in order to verify if the solution is resilient. And then at this stage, you may decide for one of the alternative solutions that has the best resilience with respect to the future scenarios. So it is a typical bottom-up approach that focuses on the current problems. And in this way, we want to identify solutions that are less costly. Of course, you may conclude that none of the solutions that to the current problems is resilient with respect to the future scenarios. And then at this stage, you may evaluate the flexibility of the solution. So a solution may be not resilient in the present form, but is it flexible? Can be updated, the solution? And this is another thing that is extremely important to consider. We have to prefer flexible solutions whenever it's possible, because it is not efficient to put in place solutions that are very costly, also in terms of environmental impact, solutions to problems that are predicted for the future with uncertainty. And what if these problems don't materialize? So it's much better that we focus on the current problem and we use flexible solutions. Of course, it may happen that this is not possible. If it is not possible, fine. At this stage, one may say the only possible solution to ensure resilience against the future climate is a solution that is costly. Or otherwise, you may adopt a solution that is more doable, more affordable, but it's not resilient. But actually, by reverting this decision-making process, you increase the likelihood of identifying the best solution in terms of current problems versus resilience versus flexibility. Because you specifically admit that the climate scenarios are used in a second step. There is I think this is already discussed. There is a sketch here, which is reported in my webpage, which identifies the three methods: top-down approach, robust. There is no infogap here. Top-down approach, future scenarios, design variables, and then solution. The RDM approach, robust decision making, which is elaborate and test new strategies, and then so scenarios, and then the vulnerability, and then there is the selection of the best solution. And then the bottom up, you start from here, assess vulnerabilities, future scenarios. Here there is a further cell with further information, a further step. So you may have, this was introduced by me actually. It is a suggestion that I give, not only future scenarios, you may have other information to evaluate. So let's consider also this additional information. And then you elaborate strategies to minimize risk to systems. Okay, I think basically we can stop here for now, but we basically, because what follows is some mention to other methods which are less important. And what I really wanted to mention to you are these three methods: Infogap, robust decision making, and decision scaling. There is not much difference between robust decision making and decision scaling. Both of them are bottom up. And then there is not much difference between them. And what I wanted to give to you is a picture of these three methods. And then what follows is just something that is, in terms of decision-making methods, is something that is marginal. Any question? Thank you very much. I know that this topic is a bit, it's not easy to synthesize in 2 hours. So I hope in your understanding, I try to do my best.